I am the movie maestro. I review films and music for your education and entertainment. What if you could go on a tour with a band? You'd probably be very excited by the notion. But the story of this particular film shows that it's very difficult even simply analyzing what goes on while journeying with even a small group. This is also a rather surprising film. For instance, comedy drama films tend to be rather awkward and clumsy when it comes to switching tones between the comedic and the dramatic scenes. And the fact that coming-of-age stories tend to have a lot of cliches that a lot of people get really tired of, but it's surprising how this film, which sets itself up to be something rather conventional, ends up being very unconventional in many ways, flipping a lot of the expectations backwards, and telling a story that feels more true to life, especially considering as it was actually based on the real-life experiences of the film's director. I am, of course, talking about the 2000 film written and directed by Cameron Crowe, Almost Famous. Patrick Fugit plays William Miller, a teenager living in San Diego in 1973, secretly aspiring to be a rock journalist under the overseeing of his overprotective, New Age, ultra-conservative mother. A professional rock journalist named Lester Bangs, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, in an extreme dose of professionalism, persevering through an extreme cold that plagued him for the entirety of a shooting unit, is very impressed by William Miller's work, and allows him to interview Black Sabbath during a concert while they arrived in San Diego on tour. Miller lacks the necessary credentials and therefore is unable to get his interview. However, he encounters a band of groupies led by Kate Hudson in one of her earlier film roles playing Penny Lane, who has connections to an uprising band called Stillwater. Miller, interested enough to go along with it, joins the band on tour, and in the process learns of the virtues and flaws of being such a group in such a particular time, and is rather perturbed by the fact that he is far more mature than almost everyone else around him, which makes sense considering as he was skipped forward several grades due to the unusual choices of his mother from before. The film is basically a series of events and something of an experience in its own way, showing Miller experiencing what goes on within the tour, the ups and the downs, and he himself maturing in his own way despite of his increased maturity and spreading his own personal wisdoms to those around him, even though in the world of bands, journalists often cannot be trusted. And indeed, Lester Bangs had informed him earlier that it's wrong to get too involved, because then one might get secretive with certain things that journalists must say. And it lends itself to a very interesting and very compelling story. There's an incredible sense of authenticity to this movie that's almost impossible to fake. Not like my earlier review of Rear Window, where the events in that one were in fact based on a real-life murder case of similar circumstance. And indeed, Cameron Crowe himself apparently went on tour with the band in his early childhood under similar circumstances, and thus the result is this incredible film. And indeed, it feels so much like real life that you can't help but wonder if it's a documentary, because it does have that type of feeling to it, like a lot of the best movies based on real-life events do. The characters all start out rather simple and rather basic, like William being basically your typical geeky teenager, and Kate Hudson's character Penny Lane being your typical groupie person with an ambition for life beyond self and embracing the music, and the band being incredibly obsessed of expressing themselves solely through the music. And yet, there's a surprising level of complexity to these characters that, again, is not an easy thing to achieve. And once more, it really contributes to the feeling that what's going on is happening in real life. And again, it's very, very difficult to do. In fact, the authenticity level is so high that lots of conventional filmmaking aspects are almost entirely absent. There's not a very straightforward pacing to the film. There is very little in the way of underscoring, with the exception of songs that are just being played on the radio. The Tiny Dancer sequence, by the way, is a particularly enjoyable scene in just how simple and how effective it is, and how it's just another day on the road. But also it just pulls itself together and comes around full circle again in a way that feels conventional but unconventional at the exact same time. One of many surprises that is in store for anybody who has not seen this film but is curious to try it. The relationships in this movie are very subtle as well. The reason why William Miller is such a geek and so surprisingly intelligent for his age is because of him skipping his grades, but it's not just used as a plot device or a character design for him to overcome. Penny Lane has a slightly haunting past that gets in the way of things and nearly leads to her death at one point, and yet she offers support in a way that's not quite like that of your average love interest character that feels somewhat obligatory in films of this type. And even the band doesn't feel like just good friends trying to make music or people with differing creative ideas and bickering all the time, though such scenes exist to imply it. But they're all written as people first. And in any film, that's probably what makes characters work the best. Don't treat them like they're objects of some sort, but rather to treat them like they're people, and then add the traits to it, but first treating them like people. And this film definitely takes advantage of that ability. One of the best things about this film, though, is the atmosphere. Because it feels very much like real life, the atmosphere is actually part of what comes out of it. And it works very, very well in creating an authenticity to the setting, and to make it easy to grasp the characters even when nothing really is going on. And the fact that the setting feels both inviting and dangerous as well shows that the place is actually somewhat ambivalent. Because it's rather typical in films to portray things in a very straightforward black and white fashion. It's very refreshing seeing something that's rather morally gray, especially for the time that this film was made. And it's really, really impressive considering how much these characters are able to say a lot about themselves without even really being very blatant about it. And it's great how even the world that feels antagonistic and the world that feels inviting, there are problems to each one, as well as good things. Like, the mother's not an antagonistic character. I mean, she's extremely conservative and strict, but she's rather terrified by the way the world is changing. But the way the world has changed can feel rather dangerous as well, as evidenced by the scene when Billy Crudup, who plays one of the main members of the band, gets incredibly high at one point. The soundtrack is great too. There's not really much in the way of an underscoring, but whenever the pop songs play, they don't just make the movie go into a montage mode, but rather they help add to the experience in a certain way, and again are rather helpful in establishing the whole atmosphere of the setting. Very, very fascinating in its own way, because this was a time period when whenever a pop song would play, it would automatically go into a montage. So I'm sure it would have taken a lot of people aback at the time. The way the film is paced is also quite incredible as well, because the film's not structured like a traditional story, so things happen, but they don't really move in a very slow fashion. And both the cinematography and the editing, as well as adding to the atmosphere, are very helpful in creating that authentic feel that this movie has. Indeed, ultimately it feels more like a documentary than a movie, or at the very least a type of emotional experience in how the moods swing and how events happen, and yet they lead into each other very well without feeling like this is just a cliched movie script being written. Ultimately, though, there was only one problem that I have with this movie, and that was that there were so many characters in this film and all of them were so fascinating, yet only a few of them were focused on. The thing is, this film can only focus on so many characters with depth without being too long. So there were lots of really interesting characters that didn't really get as much of a glimpse into as they ought to have. Also, there is the occasional moment when you can see a car that was made far beyond when the 70s existed as evidence that it wasn't made in the 70s, but it's only from looks. It just goes to show that the characters are so interesting it's enough to make an audience wish for more. Ultimately, however, Almost Famous is an excellent film. It's acted wonderfully, the cinematography, editing, atmosphere, pacing, characters, the maturity, the writing, the direction, everything about it is wonderful. So in my opinion, it's definitely worth checking out for any of those who have not seen this film so far. It's a great example of enjoying music, enjoying art, but learning that there's more to it than just the good stuff about even the things that you're the most passionate about. So for me, this movie gets a solid 4 out of 5. I give this on the worth meter a worth owning. Thank you for your time.